The evening air was heavy with dust and anger when Clara was thrust out of the small wooden house she had called home for nearly a decade. Her arms still ached from the birth she had endured just weeks before, her body not yet healed. Yet there she stood, swaying on her feet, while her husband's voice cut through the air like a whip. "You've cursed me for the last time, Clara. 3 girls, 3 worthless mouths, and not a son among them." Her husband's words burned worse than the bruise blooming on her cheek. His mother stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. To them, Clara was nothing but a failure, her worth measured only in sons she could not give. The baby cradled in her arms whimpered, and her 2 older daughters clung to her skirts, their small bodies trembling with confusion and fear. Clara had known her husband's temper, but never had she believed he would cast her out entirely. She had worked the fields, kept the house, and endured his roughness in silence, believing that was her lot in life. But the birth of her 3rd daughter had been the breaking point. Instead of joy, her husband's face had twisted with disgust, as though she had spat in the very face of God. "Get out," he had growled earlier that morning. "You and your cursed brood. A man needs sons to carry his name, not weak little girls who'll just drain a family dry." His mother had not only agreed but pushed for it, whispering venom into his ear until the decision was final. Now Clara found herself shoved toward the dirt road with nothing but the clothes on her back, 3 frightened children, and a heart splintering under the weight of shame. The neighbors had heard the shouting. Doors cracked open just wide enough for eyes to peek out, but no one dared step forward. To challenge her husband would be to invite trouble upon themselves, and so Clara was forced to endure her humiliation beneath their watchful, silent gazes. The judgment in their eyes was as sharp as any lash. Her eldest daughter, Mary, only 6 years old, tried to be brave. She wrapped her arms tightly around her mother's leg, glaring up at the house they had just been forced from. "Mama, I'll take care of you," she whispered, though her voice quivered. Clara bent down, kissing the top of her daughter's tangled hair, forcing a strength she did not feel. "You've already done more than enough, my sweet girl," she murmured. Her middle child, Ruth, was younger, too young to understand why her father's face had twisted with such hate. She whimpered softly, clinging to Clara's skirts, eyes wide with terror. And then there was the baby, tiny, fragile, wrapped in a thin blanket Clara had stitched herself. Clara pulled her closer, pressing her lips to the baby's soft forehead, silently promising protection she was not certain she could give. With a final sneer, her husband hurled a small bundle of her belongings into the dirt. "Take your rags, and go. Don't come crawling back when you starve." Clara's throat tightened, her pride battling with despair. She wanted to scream at him, to remind him of the nights she had mended his torn clothes, the mornings she had risen before the sun to cook his meals, the countless prayers she had whispered for his safety. But the words lodged in her chest, useless against a heart that had never truly valued her. Her body ached, her soul burned, but her feet moved forward. With each step down the road, her daughters stumbled beside her, their little shoes kicking up dust. Behind her, the sound of the door slamming shut echoed like a verdict. The road stretched endlessly ahead, dry and unforgiving. Clara had nowhere to go. Her own family had long since turned their backs when she married, against their advice, and the townfolk had already decided her fate. A woman without a husband, especially one tainted by bearing only daughters, was seen as a burden, even a curse. Yet Clara's heart, though battered, refused to collapse. For the sake of her girls, she swallowed her grief and pressed forward. She told herself over and over that she could not cry. Not now, not when 3 little pairs of eyes looked to her for hope. Still, in the quiet of her heart, Clara whispered a desperate prayer. "God, please, don't let this be the end for us." She didn't know that somewhere beyond the horizon, on a lonely ranch where silence reigned and a man worked his land in solitude, her prayer was already stirring an answer. The road stretched out like a ribbon of dust and despair, winding endlessly through the plains. Clara trudged forward with her 3 daughters, each step dragging heavier than the last. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, scorching the crown of her head and reddening the soft cheeks of her children. Her skirts, already torn from being shoved to the ground, clung to her legs with sweat. Her boots, worn thin from years of use, cut blisters into her feet. Each time she glanced down at her girls, Clara's heart fractured a little more. They didn't deserve this. Mary, her eldest, held her little sister Ruth's hand, urging her along with a surprising strength. For one, so young, she bit her lip hard, refusing to cry, even though her legs trembled with exhaustion. Ruth stumbled every few steps, whining softly, her small voice raspy from thirst. Clara shifted the baby in her arms. Sweet Hannah whimpered faintly, her face pinched in hunger. They had left behind everything familiar. The house Clara had worked to keep, the garden she had tended, the few meager comforts she had once called her own. Now, she had only a bundle of clothes and a scrap of bread that wouldn't last them through the night. Dust rose around them with every step, clinging to their hair, their clothes, even their lashes. Clara's throat ached with dryness, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth. She longed for the sound of water, the sight of a creek, Anything but the land around them was parched, unforgiving. The small town wasn't far, but to Clara, it felt like a world away. And worse than the distance was the dread of what awaited them there. She knew the whispers had already started. By the time she reached Main Street, word of her disgrace would have spread like wildfire. Clara was thrown out. No sons, only girls. Her husband finally had enough. The town was merciless with gossip, and Clara, already fragile, dreaded their eyes upon her. The pitying glances, the smirks of the women who had sons, the self-righteous judgment of those who believed. She had brought this upon herself, it would all be waiting. Still, she had no choice but to keep moving. She pressed forward, her arms tightening around baby Hannah, whose tiny fingers curled weakly against her mother's chest. As the sun began to sink lower, the outline of the town appeared in the distance: lean buildings, a few scattered shops, the church steeple rising above them. Clara's breath caught, half in relief, half in dread. She knew she needed food, water, and a safe place to rest her daughters. But she also knew she would be met with coldness. When they finally stepped into town, the streets were quieter than usual, though a few townsfolk lingered near the general store. Clara kept her chin lifted, though her shoulders hunched inward, as though she could shrink beneath their stares. Mrs. Abernathy, the storekeeper's wife, paused mid-step when she saw Clara, her eyes flicking to the children before hardening. With disapproval, she whispered something to another woman, who covered her mouth to hide a smirk. Clara's face burned, but she didn't falter. She walked past them, clutching her daughters close, her bundle pressing into her ribs. She stopped only long enough to buy a little milk for the baby, paying with the last coin she possessed. The storekeeper's eyes slid to the bruise on her cheek, then quickly away, as if her suffering was something shameful to even acknowledge. He handed her the milk without a word. Mary tugged at her hand. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why won't anyone talk to us?" Clara swallowed hard. "Because they don't know us, sweetheart. But we have each other, and that's what matters." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all she could give her daughter in that moment. Night fell quickly. Clara found herself sitting on the edge of town, beneath an old cottonwood tree, trying to soothe her children to sleep. She broke the scrap of bread into 3 pieces, giving one to each girl while she went hungry. She rocked Hannah gently, humming a lullaby that cracked under the weight of her exhaustion. Tears pricked her eyes, but she brushed them away. She couldn't let her daughters see her break. Somewhere in the distance, the lowing of cattle drifted. On the wind, mingling with the creak of leather saddles, Clara tensed. The sound of hooves approached, steady and sure. A lone rider was coming down the road that led from the open range to town. She drew her girls closer, her heart quickening. Out here, a woman alone was vulnerable, especially at night. But as the rider drew near, the shape of him came into view: a tall man on a broad horse. His hat low against the fading sun, his shoulders strong, his presence commanding yet somehow quiet. Clara didn't know it then, but this rider, this solitary rancher, was about to change the course of her life. The ranch stretched wide under the golden sky, rolling fields of grass that bent in the wind like waves on a restless sea. Cattle dotted the pastures, their low voices blending with the creak of windmills turning slowly in the evening air. For most men, it would have been a place of pride, a kingdom carved out of the wild. But for Ethan Cole, it was simply home, and a lonely one at that. Ethan had lived on this land since boyhood. He had worked it with his father until the old man's death, then carried the ranch through lean years and harsh winters by sheer will. The town respected him, even admired him for his hard work and quiet strength. But respect did little to fill the silence of his nights. Years ago, he had been married. His wife, Anna, had been gentle, with laughter like spring rain, but she had fallen ill not long after their wedding. By the time Ethan scraped together enough money to bring a doctor, it was too late. He buried her under the shade of a cottonwood, near the creek, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross he had carved himself. Since then, he had never remarried. Not for lack of offers. Several widows and spinsters had set their sights on him, but because his heart had refused. The land consumed his days, and the quiet consumed his nights. That evening, after tending to the cattle, Ethan rode toward town for supplies. The horse beneath him, a broad-chested bay gelding named Jasper, moved with steady strength. Ethan's tall frame was weathered from years of work, his shoulders broad, his hands scarred, but his movements carried a calm assurance. He was a man who seldom spoke unless there was something worth saying. As he drew closer to the outskirts of town, he noticed a figure beneath the old cottonwood tree, a woman, seated on the ground with 3 children gathered around her. Ethan's brow furrowed. It wasn't common to see a woman with little ones sitting on the edge of town as night fell. The closer he came, the clearer the picture became. The woman's dress was torn and dust-stained, her hair tangled, her posture exhausted, but proud. A faint bruise darkened her cheek. One arm cradled a baby, while the 2 older girls pressed close against her sides. The sight stirred something in Ethan's chest he hadn't felt in years. A pang, sharp and insistent. He slowed Jasper's pace, keeping a respectful distance. The woman's head lifted, her eyes wary, almost defiant, though he could see the fear flickering beneath. "Evenin'," Ethan said, his voice low and even. He tipped his hat slightly, as he would to any lady. The woman didn't answer at first. She tightened her hold on the baby and drew the other two closer. Ethan didn't miss the way her hand trembled, though she tried to hide it. "I don't mean trouble," he added, his tone gentle, "just passin' through." Still no response. But her eyes tired wide, the color of storm clouds studied him, as if weighing whether he was another man who would hurt her. Ethan glanced at the children. The eldest girl, no more than 6, stared back with a stubbornness that reminded him of himself at that age. The younger one leaned into her mother's side, eyelids heavy with sleep, and the baby stirred restlessly, whimpering for milk. He dismounted slowly, careful not to startle them, and pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. He crouched and set it on the ground a few paces away. "Water," he said simply. "For the little ones, if you've a mind to take it." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting from him to the canteen. Finally, she reached for it with trembling fingers, unscrewing the cap and guiding it to her eldest's lips. The girl drank greedily, then passed it to her sister. Clara, though Ethan didn't yet know her name, took only a sip before offering some to the baby. Ethan said nothing more. He stood with quiet patience, watching as relief softened the children's faces. He felt the familiar ache in his chest. Again, sharper this time. Most men would have kept walking. Most would have muttered about scandal or shame, but Ethan's heart refused to let him turn away. The woman finally looked at him again, her voice hoarse when she spoke. "Why? Why are you helping us?" Ethan adjusted his hat, his gaze steady. "Because no one else is." The words hung in the cooling air between them, and though neither of them knew it, yet this moment, the weary woman with her daughters, the lonely rancher with an empty house would mark the beginning of something neither had dared hope for. Clara's body was taut with mistrust. Every muscle in her ached from the long day's walk. Yet when the tall rancher dismounted and stood nearby, her back stiffened as though bracing for a blow. Men, especially strong ones with broad shoulders and hard eyes, had only ever brought her pain. But this man was different. He hadn't barked orders or spat insults. He hadn't looked at her with disgust or pity. Instead, his movements were measured, quiet, respectful. He had left the water a few paces away, as if to say, "I won't come closer unless you allow it." Clara's daughters sensed her hesitation. Mary clung to her skirt, whispering, "Mama, is he bad?" Ruth, too tired to stand, pressed her head against Clara's side, eyelids drooping. The baby whimpered again, her tiny cries scraping against Clara's raw nerves. The rancher cleared his throat softly, not in impatience but in gentle courtesy. "Name's Ethan Cole," he said. His voice was steady, the kind that carried weight without needing to rise. "I keep a ranch a few miles out." Clara said nothing. She shifted her baby higher against her chest, rocking gently. "I reckon you've had a hard go," Ethan continued after a moment. "Don't mean to pry, but it's plain, you and the young'uns need food, rest." Clara's throat tightened. Pride and shame warred inside her. Tangled with desperation, she had been taught never to rely on anyone, especially not a man. But one look at her girls' dust-streaked faces, hungry bellies, tiny shoulders, sagging broke her heart. I don't need charity," she managed, her voice hoarse. Ethan tilted his head, considering her words. "Didn't say you did. My table's set, whether you sit at it or not. But I got stew waitin', and enough to spare." Her stomach twisted at the thought of stew, warm, rich, filling. She hadn't tasted more than scraps in days, not since the morning her husband had cast her out. The scent of memory alone made her mouth water, though she fought to hide it. Mary looked up, eyes wide. "Mama, please," she whispered. The faint hope in her daughter's voice nearly undid Clara. She turned her gaze back to the rancher, studying him through the fading twilight. His face was rugged, weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held no cruelty. They were steady, patient, the color of dark earth after rain. Still, fear clawed at her chest. What if this is a trick? What if he's kind now but turns cruel once were under his roof? She had seen men change in an instant, their tenderness curdling into violence. As if sensing her thoughts, Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "You can ride along with me, or walk. I won't lay a hand on you, ma'am, nor your girls. But I won't leave you sittin' out here neither. Too dangerous coyotes, drifters worse." Clara hesitated. Her breath came shallow and uneven. Trust was not something she could give freely anymore. It had been beaten out of her. But the weight of her baby in her arms, the pleading eyes of Mary, the trembling fatigue of Ruth, these left her with little choice. Slowly, she nodded. Ethan inclined his head, as if acknowledging the courage it had taken. He moved back to his horse, giving her space, and secured the canteen once more. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a wool blanket, laying it over Jasper's flank. "The little ones can ride with me," he said gently. "You can walk beside us if you'd rather." Clara's breath caught. He wasn't forcing her onto his horse, wasn't assuming control. He was offering, giving her the decision. That, more than anything, stirred a tiny spark of something she thought she had lost forever: dignity. "I'll walk," she said quietly, "but the girls, they can ride." Ethan nodded once. With careful hands, he lifted Mary onto Jasper's back, then Ruth, steadying them as if they were his own kin. Both girls clutched the saddle horn with wide-eyed awe, their earlier fear forgotten for a moment. Clara shifted the baby, who had finally drifted into restless sleep, and took her place beside the horse. As they started down the road, Ethan rode slow, matching Clara's weary pace. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't harsh. It was a silence filled with unspoken understanding, his patience, her caution, their shared knowledge of hardship. For the first time in days, Clara felt a flicker of safety, though fragile and uncertain. The night air cooled around them, the stars appearing like small lanterns overhead. She kept her eyes forward, heart still guarded, yet deep inside, she whispered a thought she dared not speak aloud. Maybe this man is different, and though she didn't know it yet, that decision to trust a stranger just enough to follow him would change not only her life, but her daughter's lives forever. The ride to Ethan's ranch was quiet, broken only by the creak of Jasper's saddle and the soft night sounds of crickets chirping in the grass. Clara walked beside the horse, her skirts brushing the dusty road, her baby warm and heavy against her chest. Every few steps, she glanced up at her daughters perched on the saddle. Mary sat tall, trying to look brave, while Ruth leaned against her sister, eyelids drooping from exhaustion. The sight eased some of Clara's fear. For the first time since being cast out, her girls weren't stumbling in the dirt or begging for food. They were safe, if only for the moment. Still, her heart beat hard with caution. She had trusted before and paid dearly for it. When the ranch finally came into view, Clara blinked in surprise. She had expected something grand, the kind of spread only wealthy men owned. Instead, it was humble but strong, a sprawling barn, weathered fencing, fields dotted with cattle, and a sturdy house with lamplight glowing in the windows. The place radiated work and care, not vanity. Ethan dismounted in one smooth motion and helped Mary and Ruth down with the gentleness of a man used to handling fragile things. He didn't reach for Clara, though his gaze flicked briefly toward the baby in her arms, as if to make sure she was all right. "Come on in," he said simply, nodding toward the house. "You'll find a warm fire and supper waitin'." Clara hesitated on the porch, her hand hovering near the doorknob. Stepping inside another man's home felt like stepping into the unknown, but the scent of stew drifted out, a rich, savory smell of beef and vegetables simmered with herbs. Her stomach clenched, betraying her hunger. Inside, the house was neat and practical. The walls bore no fancy adornments, only a few shelves lined with books and a rifle mounted above the hearth. A braided rug lay across the floor, worn but clean. The fire crackled, casting a golden glow that seemed to chase away some of the darkness pressing on her spirit. "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing toward the table already set with bowls and bread. He ladled steaming stew into the bowls and placed them before the girls first. Mary looked at her mother, waiting for permission. Clara gave a small nod, and the child eagerly dug in. Ruth followed, her spoon clumsy but determined. Clara sat stiffly, baby Hannah still nestled in her arms. Ethan set a bowl in front of her, along with a clean cloth for the child. She stared at it, her pride pricking. "What if he thinks me weak? What if taking his food binds me to some hidden debt?" "You'll need strength," Ethan said quietly, reading the conflict in her face. "For them, if not for yourself." The words pierced her. Slowly, she picked up the spoon and tasted the stew. Warmth spread through her chest, easing some of the hollow ache in her stomach. Tears stung her eyes, though she blinked them back before they could fall. The girls ate until their bellies were full, their faces softening with contentment. Mary even smiled, a small, fleeting thing that made Clara's throat tighten with gratitude. After supper, Ethan cleared the bowls himself, refusing Clara's attempts to help. "You've had enough burden for one day," he said. His tone held no condescension, only quiet certainty. He showed them a small room at the back of the house. The bed was simple, the quilt hand-stitched, the air faintly scented of cedar. "It was my sister's when she stayed here for a spell," he explained. "You and the little ones can rest here tonight." Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. Her instinct was to refuse, to say she would sleep on the floor with her children. But the sight of the quilt, the promise of real rest, and the weight of exhaustion pressed against her resolve. She laid Hannah down first, tucking the baby gently beneath the quilt. Ruth clambered onto the bed beside her sister, curling up with a sigh of relief. Mary climbed in last, her eyes heavy but still watching Clara for reassurance. "You'll stay, Mama," she whispered. Clara smoothed her daughter's hair. "I'll be right here." When Ethan left them alone, closing the door softly, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. She knew better than to trust a man's kindness too quickly, yet she couldn't deny the truth. He had offered food, shelter, and dignity without demanding anything in return. As her daughters drifted into sleep, their faces peaceful for the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself one fragile breath of relief. She wasn't safe, yet not fully. But maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where hope could begin again. And though she didn't realize it, Ethan sat by the fire in the next room, staring into the flames, his thoughts circling around the woman and children now under his roof. He had lived years in silence, years with only the land for company. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, his house didn't feel quite so empty. By morning, Clara's daughters were still asleep when the first light of dawn crept through the window. For the first time in weeks, they had slept through the night without waking hungry or shivering from cold. Clara sat quietly on the edge of the bed, baby Hannah in her arms, listening to the steady breathing of her children. Ethan had left early to tend the cattle, but not before setting out bread, butter, and fresh milk on the kitchen table. Clara stared at the simple meal in disbelief. No demands, no harsh words, just food, waiting. She wanted to feel safe, but a whisper of dread gnawed at her heart. What will people say when they know I stayed here? In a town like theirs, nothing stayed secret. By mid-morning, her fears proved true. At the general store, Mrs. Abernathy leaned across the counter, whispering to a neighbor as though she were sharing a scandalous secret. I saw her with my own eyes, Clara, marching into town yesterday, dirty as a stray dog, with those 3 girls trailing behind her. And now, she lowered her voice dramatically. She's up at Ethan Cole's place. The neighbor's eyes widened. Ethan Cole, the widower. He took her in. Mrs. Abernathy sniffed, clearly enjoying the moment. Fed her to my husband. Said he saw him buying extra flour and beans last week. And now we know why. Within hours, the whispers spread from the store to the church steps, then to the saloon. Men paused in their card games to shake their heads. Women clucked their tongues in disapproval as they hung laundry or fetched water. Some muttered that Ethan was foolish. Others went further, calling Clara shameless for entangling herself with a decent man after being thrown out by her husband. No one bothered to ask Clara's side of the story. By afternoon, when Ethan rode into town for supplies, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. He could feel the stairs prickling against his back as he tied Jasper to the hitching post. Men muttered into their beards. Women turned their heads quickly, pretending not to look while whispering behind their hands. Ethan walked into the store, his tall frame filling the doorway. Silence fell for a brief moment before Mrs. Abernathy forced a polite smile. Mr. Cole, she said, her tone dripping with forced sweetness. How surprising to see you today. Ethan met her gaze without flinching. Need flour, coffee, sugar. His voice was calm, but firm. Mrs. Abernathy bustled about, filling his order, but not without slipping in a remark. Word is, you've got company up at your place, a woman and 3 little girls. Surely you know what folks will say. Ethan's jaw tightened. He leaned slightly across the counter, his eyes steady on hers. Let 'em say what they like. The room went still. Mrs. Abernathy's lips parted as though to argue, but something in Ethan's unyielding stare silenced her. She hurried to wrap his parcels, handing them over without another word. Outside, a group of men loitered near the blacksmith shop. One called out, "Hey Cole, heard you're running a boarding house now. You charge by the night, or just talkin' in strays for free?" Laughter rippled through the group. Ethan didn't so much as blink. He secured his supplies to Jasper's saddle, then turned to face them squarely. "That woman's been wronged," he said evenly, "and she's under my roof now. Anyone got a problem with that can bring it to me direct." The laughter died. None of the men dared step forward. They all knew Ethan's reputation, not as a hothead, but as a man who never backed down once he made up his mind. That night, when Ethan returned home, Clara noticed the hardness in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a weight heavier than cattle work. She suspected what had happened in town. "You shouldn't have to defend us," she whispered as they cleaned up after supper. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You don't owe those folks a thing, Clara. Neither do your girls. You've got a right to be treated with decency. If folks don't like it, that's their trouble, not yours." Clara's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not as if she were a burden, not as if she were a mistake to hide. For the first time, she saw not just kindness in Ethan's eyes, but strength, the strength that seemed willing to shield her from the cruel judgment of the world. Still, doubt lingered in her heart. The town had turned its back on her once already. Could she really find a future here, in a place that whispered behind her back? That night, as her daughters slept peacefully in the borrowed bed, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. One truth became clearer with every passing minute: she could no longer walk this road alone. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan Cole was the one man willing to walk beside her, no matter what the town said. Days slipped into weeks on Ethan Cole's ranch, and for the first time in years, Clara began to breathe without the constant fear of a blow or a cruel word. Life was still hard, as all ranch life was, but it was a clean sort of heart, the kind that left her tired at the end of the day, not broken. Every morning, Ethan rose before dawn, the rhythm of his boots steady against the wooden floor as he headed out to the barns. At first, Clara kept her distance, tending only to her daughters and keeping the small room they slept in neat, as if to prove her worth. But Ethan never demanded proof. Instead, he offered space. When Clara tentatively began helping in the kitchen, he didn't object or criticize. He simply accepted the bread she baked, the stew she simmered, eating quietly but with a nod of appreciation that spoke louder than words. Gradually, Clara found herself venturing beyond the kitchen. She began to sweep the porch, mend torn shirts, and eventually step out into the yard, where the air smelled of earth and hay. The work steadied her, giving her back something she thought she had lost: purpose. The girls flourished in ways that surprised even Clara. Mary, with her bold spirit, trailed after Ethan whenever he let her, asking endless questions about the cattle, the horses, even the fence posts. Ethan answered patiently, never once brushing her aside. Ruth, who had been so timid and clingy after their banishment, began to laugh again. Clara often found her sitting near the barn, holding a basket of kittens born to one of Ethan's barn cats, her giggles carrying on the wind. Baby Hannah thrived as well, her cheeks filling out with the milk and food Clara could finally give her. Sometimes, when Clara was too tired to rock the baby in her arms, Ethan would take her gently, his big hands cradling her as though she were spun glass. He would hum low and quiet, a sound that rumbled like distant thunder but soothed the child instantly. Clara often watched those moments with a mixture of awe and confusion. How could a man so rugged, who bore the weight of acres of land and livestock on his back, handle her baby with such gentleness? One evening, after supper, Clara found herself sitting on the porch with Ethan as the sky turned pink and gold. The girls played in the yard, their laughter mingling with the chirping of crickets. Clara smoothed her worn skirt nervously, feeling the words press against her lips. "I should thank you," she said softly. Ethan turned his head, one brow raised. "For what?" "For all of this. For giving us a place, for not asking anything in return." Her voice trembled with the weight of it. Men don't do things like this." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark. "In the fading light, a man's only worth the promises he keeps," he said finally. "I told you I wouldn't harm you or the little ones. That's all there is to it." Clara dropped her gaze, her fingers twisting together. "I don't know how to trust anymore." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms folding across his chest. "Don't reckon you need to not all at once. Trust takes its time." The simplicity of his words hit her harder than any sermon. She realized then that Ethan wasn't trying to earn her trust with grand gestures. He was simply showing up each day, steady as the sun rising, letting his actions speak for him. Slowly, Clara began to heal. The bruises faded, but more importantly, the invisible wounds, the ones carved deep into her spirit, began to mend. She smiled more often, even laughed when Ruth dragged a squawking chicken into the house or when Mary tried to ride Jasper without permission. At night, when she tucked her daughters into bed, she no longer whispered prayers of pure desperation. Instead, she whispered words of thanks for food, for safety, for the kindness of a man who asked for nothing. Yet deep inside, a small fragile seed had begun to grow, something she hadn't dared hope for in years. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just relief. It was the faint stirring of something warmer, something more dangerous. Clara caught herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, watching the way he moved, the steadiness of his hands, the quiet strength in his face. She reminded herself, she couldn't afford such feelings. She had her daughters to think of. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she admitted the truth to herself. Ethan Cole wasn't just helping her heal. He was making her believe, for the first time, that she was worthy of being loved. The summer sky was heavy that evening, the kind that made the air feel thick, as though a storm were crouched just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. Clara had just finished hanging laundry on the line while her girls played in the dust near the porch. Inside the barn, Ethan's steady hammering rang out as he repaired a broken stall. It was in that fragile, quiet hour that trouble came riding. 3 riders appeared at the edge of Ethan's land, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Clara's blood turned to ice. She would know the cut of those shoulders, the swagger in the way the man in front sat his horse, anywhere. Her husband, Tom, behind him, rode 2 of his brothers, hard-eyed and mean-mouthed men who had mocked Clara for years. Their arrival was no accident. It was a claim, an intrusion, and a warning all in one. Clara's daughters sensed the danger even before she spoke. Ruth clung to her skirts, while Mary narrowed her little eyes, defiant but trembling. Clara hurried them toward the porch, her heart hammering as Tom dismounted. Well, Tom sneered, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Look at this. My runaway wife, playing house with a rancher." Clara's throat closed, but Ethan emerged from the barn before she could speak. He walked toward them, his face calm but his posture sharp with readiness, like a wolf scenting a threat. "You've ridden far enough," Ethan said evenly, stopping between Clara and the men. "This here's my land. You've no business on it." Tom laughed, a harsh sound. "Your land, maybe, but that there woman is mine. She belongs to me and so do those brats of hers. You think you can keep what's mine, Cole?" Clara flinched at his words, but Ethan didn't so much as blink. His voice was steady as stone when he answered. "She's under my roof, my protection. You laid your claim down the day you beat her and cast her out. She's not going anywhere with you." Tom's jaw clenched, and his brothers dismounted. the three of them squaring off against Ethan. Clara's breath came shallow and fast. She knew how quick Tom's temper could flare, how violence simmered just beneath his skin. Protection. Tom spat. You call keeping another man's wife in your house decent? This is adultery. This is theft. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. No, this is a woman choosing freedom, and I'll stand by her choice. The silence that followed crackled with danger. Tom's hand twitched near the knife on his belt, and one of his brothers muttered something about teaching Ethan a lesson. Clara wanted to scream, to pull Ethan back, to shield her girls from what felt inevitable, but Ethan didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice lower now, but carrying a weight that even Tom couldn't ignore. You laid your hands on her and left her to starve with your children. That's not a man. That's a coward. And if you think I'll hand her back to that kind of life, you don't know me at all. For the first time, Tom hesitated. The certainty in Ethan's voice was like steel, unbendable, unbreakable. The brothers muttered curses, but they didn't advance. Something in Ethan's stance warned them he wouldn't back down, and if it came to blows, he would fight with everything he had. Clara, her heart pounding, found her own voice. Then she stepped out from behind Ethan, her daughters clinging to her skirts, and faced the man who had called himself her husband. I'm not yours anymore. Tom, she said, her voice shaking but strong. You beat me, shamed me, and cast me out like garbage. But I am not garbage, and I will not go back to you. The words seemed to hang in the air, a crack of lightning before the storm. Tom's face darkened, his pride stung by her defiance. He spat on the ground, then jerked his reins and swung back into his saddle. This ain't over, he snarled. You'll regret this, both of you. The three men wheeled their horses and thundered back down the road, a cloud of dust trailing behind them. Only when they disappeared over the horizon did Clara release the breath she had been holding. She pressed a hand to her chest, her whole body trembling. Ethan turned to her then, his eyes softer now, though still edged with the steel of a man who meant every word he'd spoken. They'll be back, Clara whispered, dread curling in her stomach. Maybe, Ethan admitted, but you won't face them alone. In that moment, something shifted between them. Clara had always believed she had to fight her battles alone, that no one would ever stand beside her. But Ethan had stood, unflinching, against the storm. That was her past. And though the threat still lingered, for the first time in years, Clara felt something stronger than fear rise within her. Hope. The days after Tom's confrontation stretched long and uneasy. Though the sun rose each morning over the wide pastures and the girls' laughter echoed through the barn, a shadow hung heavy over Clara's heart. She knew Tom's words had not been idly, would return, and likely not alone. Yet beneath that dread was a new awareness. Fragile but undeniable. She had spoken against him. For the first time in years, Clara had stood her ground. The memory of her own voice steadied her strength. Ethan noticed the change in her, though he said nothing at first. He simply worked alongside her, letting her find her rhythm. Clara helped mend fences and carried water to the stock, her skirts stained with dust, her arms sore from labor. There was dignity in it, work given freely, not forced with cruelty. One evening, as she tucked the girls into bed, Ruth whispered, "Mama, are we going to have to go back to him?" Her daughter's blue eyes glistened with fear, and Clara felt her throat tighten. She brushed Ruth's hair back from her forehead, speaking softly but with conviction. "No, sweetheart, we'll never go back to that life." The promise hung in the air, binding Clara not only to her children but to herself. She could not falter now. The next morning, she found Ethan sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife. The rising sun cast gold over his shoulders, and he looked more solid than ever, a man carved from the very earth he worked. Clara hesitated before joining him, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "You know they'll come back," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "I know." She studied his face, searching for fear, but found none, only resolve. He would stand against Tom's rage without question. But what about her? Could she ask him to shoulder such a burden? "You've done more than enough for us already," Clara said, her voice trembling. "You don't owe me anything. If it would be safer for you for your ranch." Ethan set the knife down with a deliberate motion and turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. "Clara, don't finish that sentence. You and those girls belong here as much as I do. Don't ever think you're a burden." His words sank deep, wrapping around the ache in her chest. For years, she had been told she was less of a wife, less of a woman, less of a person because she hadn't given birth to a son. Yet here was a man telling her she was enough. More than enough. That Sunday, Clara gathered her courage and went with Ethan and the girls into town. The air bristled with whispers as they walked down Main Street. Women paused at the well. Men leaned against storefronts, all watching. Some shook their heads, whispering about scandal. Others looked away, unwilling to take sides. But Clara noticed, too, a few pairs of eyes that held something different: curiosity, even sympathy. At the general store, the tension reached its peak. Tom's mother stood by the counter, her lips pursed tight as she spotted Clara. "You've shamed this town," the older woman hissed, loud enough for others to hear. "Running from your husband, flaunting yourself like a harlot. Clara's face burned, but before she could shrink back, Ethan stepped forward. His voice was calm, but rang through the store like a hammer striking iron. She's no harlot, she's a good woman and a fine mother, and I won't stand by while anyone slanders her under my watch. Gasps rippled through the store. The shopkeeper glanced nervously between Ethan and Tom's mother, but Clara felt something inside her break free. She took a deep breath, lifting her chin. I'm not ashamed anymore, Clara said, her voice clear. I bore daughters, and I will not apologize for that. My girls are blessings, not curses. If anyone cannot see, that it is their blindness, not mine. A hush fell. The boldness in her words startled even Clara, but she saw her daughter's wide eyes shining with pride, and strength filled her anew. When they left the store, Ethan tipped his hat to her, a faint smile on his lips. You found your voice, he said. Clara's steps felt lighter than they had in years. She realized she was no longer running from her past, she was choosing her future. And that future lay not with Tom's cruelty, nor with the townsfolk's gossip, but with the safety, dignity, and quiet strength she had found beside Ethan. That night, as the girls drifted to sleep in their small shared bed, Clara stood at the window, looking out at the vast, starlit plains. The road behind her was filled with pain, but the one ahead held something new, something she had once thought impossible. Hope, and this time, it wasn't fleeting. It was hers to claim. The wind carried the smell of spring across the open plains, stirring the tall grass into waves of green and gold. On the porch of Ethan's ranch house, Clara stood with her hands resting on the railing, watching her daughters chase one another near the barn. Their laughter rose like music, bright and unbroken, no longer edged with fear. It was hard to believe that just weeks ago, she had arrived here broken and bruised, uncertain if she could even stand on her own 2 feet again. Now, there was life in her eyes and color in her cheeks. Each day brought her closer to a version of herself she thought she had lost long ago. Behind her, Ethan's boots creaked across the wood. He carried a basket of tools, fresh from mending the corral, and set it down with a heavy thud. For a moment, he didn't speak, only looked at her in that steady, patient way of his. Clara had grown used to his silence. It was never cold, but full of thought, as though he was waiting for the right words. You've done well with them, Ethan finally said, nodding toward the girls. They're happy here. Clara's throat tightened. Because of you. You gave them safety. He shook his head gently. Safety's one thing. Happiness, that's because of you, Clara. You've given them more love than most children ever see in a lifetime. The warmth of his words settled over her, a balm on the scars she still carried. For years she had been made to believe that her daughters were burdens, that she had failed her worth as a woman. Yet Ethan, with his quiet conviction, had undone that cruel lie piece by piece. As the days turned 2 weeks, Clara and the girls became part of the rhythm of the ranch. She learned to milk the cow before dawn, to cook hearty meals for hungry ranch hands, to mend clothes torn by barbed wire. Her hands bore calluses, her arms grew strong, and with every task she felt herself growing into a life that was not only survival but belonging. The girls thrived, too. Ruth, the eldest, proved quick with numbers and started helping Ethan keep track of cattle counts. Little Mary loved the horses, following Ethan into the stables until she learned to brush and saddle them herself. And tiny Anna, though still clumsy, filled the ranch with songs she made up on the spot, her laughter infectious. Ethan never treated them as intruders or outsiders. He lifted them onto his shoulders, taught them how to hold the reins, and even let them help drive nails into fence posts. Clara often watched them together, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something far more tender, a longing that frightened her, yet warmed her all the same. One evening, after supper, Ethan lingered at the table while Clara cleared the dishes. The girls were already upstairs, their giggles echoing faintly as they prepared for bed. The lantern light flickered between them, throwing shadows across the walls. Clara, Ethan began, his voice unusually hesitant. I've been meaning to ask you something. She paused, holding a dishcloth in her hands, waiting. Been through more than any woman should have to endure. I won't press you, and I don't want to frighten you. But, he took a slow breath. I want you to know, this place isn't just mine anymore. It's yours, and the girls. If you'd have it, I'd like us to build this life together, for good. Clara froze, her heart pounding. The words weren't spoken like a demand or a claim, but an offering. Ethan wasn't rescuing her out of pity, nor binding her out of duty. He was asking. Tears stung her eyes. You'd want me, even after everything. Ethan reached across the table, his rough hand brushing hers with gentle certainty. Especially after everything. You've shown me more courage than I ever thought possible. You and those girls are the family I never knew I was waiting for. Her voice cracked, but she managed the words. Then yes, I'd have it. The following Sunday, the ranch hands, townsfolk, and even a few who had once doubted her gathered beneath the cottonwoods, with the girls standing proudly at their side. Clara and Ethan spoke their vows simply, without grandeur, but with truth in every syllable. When it was done, Ruth slipped her small hand into Ethan's, whispering, Papa, he looked startled for a moment, then his eyes softened as he squeezed her hand. Clara's breath caught, tears of joy blurring her vision. That night, as the stars spilled across the endless prairie sky, Clara stood once more at the porch railing. Ethan joined her, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. The girl's soft snores drifted from inside the house. She leaned into him, no longer carrying the weight of shame or fear. She had been cast aside for giving birth to daughters. But here, those same daughters were cherished, loved, and celebrated. Here, she was not less. She was whole. For the first time in her life, Clara felt that the future was not something to dread, but something to welcome. Together, with Ethan and her girls, she was beginning, not just a new chapter, but a new story altogether, a story written not in suffering, but in love.